Welcome everyone to Sieta, Florida 2021 Black History Month event. Before we start, just some housekeeping items. When you're not speaking, I invite everybody to stay muted. You can leave your video on or not. It's up to you. And you can also write in the comments, in the chat, where you're calling from, who you are, and if you have any questions, just put it in the chat and I will be ready and happy to read them. There will be a Q&A opportunity during the whole presentation, so please feel free to ask any question. And as we put this subject, we had already some questions touching white privilege, cultural identity, racism, oppression, so you're willing to add any questions that you want, okay? And the session is recorded. So that was housekeeping. Welcome everyone again to Sieta, Florida 2021 Black History Month event. So my name is Yuko de Neuville and I am the immediate past president of Sieta, Florida. And today I am your host and moderator. So I'm pleased to present the Black America panel discussion featuring three amazing panelists, Rachel Assignon, Christopher Robinson, and Patricia Malidor-Coleman. So the voices of our panelists bring a diverse perspective on the subject of Black America, and allow me now to bring them to the stage, first with an introduction of each of them. So let's start with the gentleman. Let's do this thing differently today. And we'll start with Christopher Robinson, who is a leadership development trainer and career coach, currently serving in workforce development with the United States Air Force, a doctoral candidate in organizational learning and leadership with a specialization in human resource development. He has participated with various committees on diversity and inclusion, which includes facilitating corporate lessons on diversity in the workplace. Welcome, Christopher. So now about Rachel Assignon. She is an instructional designer who started her career as a French teacher, and she speaks French fluently, by the way. She realized very early in her teaching career that language learning must be wrapped with lessons in cultural intelligence. An advocate for diversity, equity, and inclusion, Rachel serves as program ambassador for Sieta, Florida, currently, and on the DEI committee at her place of employment. Welcome, Rachel, and thank you for being here. Patricia Malidor-Coleman, also known as Miss Globalicious. Who doesn't know Miss Globalicious, right, today? Everybody knows her. She is the owner of A to Z World Connections, a consulting, coaching, and training company specializing in international education, global diversity, as well as global talent and international life transition development. Patricia is also the co-author of Cultural Detective African American, and she's an international speaker on matters of race and cultural identity around the world. And she is the founder of Sieta, Florida, and a former president of Sieta, USA. Welcome, Patricia, Miss Globalicious.
Thank you, everyone. Good to see so many familiar names. Thank you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. And we have, I can see in the chat that we have people calling from Minnesota, St. Pete Beach, Adventura, Atlanta. Wonderful. Welcome, everyone. So now, without further ado, I would like to ask to our panelists, our three panelists, the question: why is this topic is near and dear to your heart? And whoever wants to start, go ahead.
I'll go ahead and start us off and just say this topic is very near and dear to my heart because it as an African-American male in America, having served in the armed forces as well, this is something that I'm very passionate about because it's about bringing more awareness and helping people to understand the rich history but also some of the challenges that we still face. I think in some regards, the several incidents that we had, very tragic incidents that we had in 2020, are not just flashpoints, but it's a continuation of some of the things that have happened for hundreds of years here in America that we need to address. So it's important for us to continue to have these conversations, but to begin the process of actually having some policies enacted and some things that can be put forward that will allow us to hopefully move towards healing, move towards a place and a space where we can certainly see that being Black in America should not be something that is looked or viewed as a negative, but should be a positive, and we should be treated as such. So bringing more awareness to this topic, I believe is vitally important. So thank you for the opportunity to share.
Rachel, you want to go ahead or you want me to jump in?
Yes, I'd be happy to. Thank you so much for opening us up, Yuko. I am honored to be on this panel with both Chris and Patricia. I am Caucasian, and according to my ancestry DNA, I am 100% Western European. The reason that this is very near and dear to my heart is that this is not just a Black issue. This is a humanitarian issue. This is a social justice issue. And it is my firm belief that we all have to get involved in order to affect change. Women wouldn't have been given the right to vote if men didn't become allies for them. And we see this in so many other areas of social justice where we have to become allies and join in the discussion and in the fight. So that is my reason for this being a very important topic.
Thank you so much, Chris and Rachel. So in my case, I am a woman of color, and cultural identity has been, I would say, a journey and adventure of curiosity since I was little, because I never knew what I was. So Yuko was my co-facilitator of a What Are You once session where people just couldn't put the finger of what we were. My Black identity, my Black blood is very important to me. On my father's side, I'm a biracial woman of European descent, born and raised in France, and a true product of colonization, as we have African, Caribbean, Indian blood in the family. So arriving in the US as an international student, I was definitely not seen as a person of color. I was more seen as a Latina, which helped my Spanish, by the way, so jumped in. But I consider myself as a woman of color. And I married into an African-American family. And I truly started to understand the difference of being a colored woman, which we say in French, femme de couleur, a person of color, and an African-American woman, quite different. I have two children who identify as African-American, a son who I truly was scared for when Trayvon Martin was killed in Florida, and my ex-husband, who very much looked like Eric Gardner, and who also was shot and killed as a Black man. So I live the fear last year of George Floyd. I was really not comfortable on top of COVID and confinement. So when we do the work of global diversity and intercultural work, we walk the talk, but to be honest with you, I'm suffering as along with a lot of African American because I can feel the pain. And it's about pain. The diversity work is very much about pain. It's not as fun as intercultural work. So I bring to the table my understanding and my perspective as a woman of color from elsewhere, but who's very much nested into the African American community.
Thank you very much, Rachel and Patricia and Christopher, for sharing why this topic is very near and dear to your heart. before this discussion, we had some question about white privilege. Would any of you care to comment about what you have seen, maybe in action, or provide an example about white privilege?
I guess I can jump in on this one. I was unaware that white privilege was even a thing until probably a few years ago, maybe 5-6 years ago. I grew up in the suburbs of Rochester, New York, and our claim to fame is that that is the place where Susan B. Anthony is from, and also that's where Frederick Douglass retired, and he's actually buried there. So we considered ourselves a very multicultural and inclusive and very embracing city. It was heartbreaking to hear about this Daniel Prude situation, and they actually just deliberated on that this week. Being born in the suburbs of Rochester and being raised there, while I was interested in other cultures and languages, I didn't really realize that my skin doesn't pose a threat to others. When I get pulled over for speeding, and I got pulled over a lot when I was younger, my biggest fear was getting a ticket. And I didn't realize that for the Black community and other people of color, that the fear is, am I going to live through this? Am I going to be shot and killed? I was removed from that. That was not anything I ever had to think about and deal with. And that's just one example of white privilege from my own life. And I'm eager to hear what Patricia and Chris have to say about it too, though.
You're muted, Patricia.
These are difficult conversations, and I'd like to give you an example that may make you smile versus and still realize it's a serious situation. So, out of grad school, I had an immediate international career in upper level management. So I pretty much traveled the world and going out with clients, and just whining and cleansing people around the world. And many cases in the US, in the Caribbean, so around the world. So that's to give you an example of that white privilege and then how brown people are seen. In many cases, the waiters would look more at the people around the table and not me, where I'm the one with the platinum credit card going to pay the bill and give a tip. So that's the joke of it. And many times I had to redirect, attention. If I ask any questions, the answer would be given to somebody else. And when it was time to pay, that's when I realized, wait a second, in this case, it's more ascribed privilege. It's not that the people around me felt that they had white privilege, but it is assumed that privilege of being somebody of power, somebody with the buying power, the decision making, is going to be the white person. So that's a lot of my my experience. But the good thing is that I recognize it early and I approached it in a very diplomatic way. And it's not easy to do. It's something that I now teach people of color on how to be, not to be angry at those situations, but to recognize them and educate others.
And Patricia and Rachel, and to our panel here today, I was first introduced to the article by Peggy McIntosh, White Privilege, several years ago while I was still on active duty. And it was an opportunity for us to supplement one of our diversity lessons to try to bring about more awareness to this topic. It really does, in a lot of ways, helps us to understand the history, but it also helps us to see that there's still those disparities still to this day that are not being acknowledged and recognized because of the title itself, perhaps maybe sometimes. Maybe there are some who are just in denial or maybe it's because of some of the unconscious biases that people may have towards it. But nevertheless, it was utilized as a way to help us to have a greater sense of awareness regarding the topic. And it was used as a tool to help us educate our students, our learners, on the seriousness of this and how it still plays a role to this day. And again, that was introduced to me several years ago. And I believe now with Dr. Robin DiAngelo and her book, it's become something that is a little bit more commonplace now. But back then it was still relatively unknown. And I believe now we have a better understanding of what it is. I think the real issue is trying to get people to understand how to take that information and how do I apply that, or how do I see that impacting my life or the lives of others that I work with.
And I'm not quite sure how many of the audience is into the diversity or intercultural world, but you're here obviously because you're interested in the topic. Hopefully we can hear from you, but the element of bias, unconscious bias is there at all levels. For me also, white privilege is something that people are either born with, or again, it's been ascribed. And an example that I often give is if you have 5 men standing in front of you, 2 of them are Black, one is 7 foot, the other one is 5'8". Who do you give the ball to, basketball to? Who do you give first? Who do you give the basketball to second? And people just recognize, right, that's the unconscious bias. So it's the same thing. We feel that what we see should receive a certain respect, or some kind of a preferential treatment based on how we grew up. So that belief system is there, and those biases are there as well. So for me, I more and more I try to talk with people who have white privilege and don't realize it. And the way that I introduce it also to make it a comfortable conversation, I say that as a woman of color, of European descent, and with who comes more from classism than the experience of racism, I come with high privilege when I came as an international student, and people I'm not quite sure to understand, and when they start going into my life and my family and my dad and my parents and their position in society, for me, it was like, well, who do you think you are? Because you don't know who I am. And I had a conversation recently. So classism is huge. So privilege, once is first of it requires others to respond to us a certain way. And white privilege is definitely one that just comes naturally for others. So there's more conversations to be done around that.
Yes, and we have a comment from Brett here too, who says the confusion around the definition of white privilege is something that needs to be addressed.
I agree. I think that is something that needs to be addressed. And as I have spoken with other white people about white privilege, there is a little bit of that fragility that Chris just mentioned from Robin DiAngelo's book called White Fragility, which I highly recommend people pick up and read. A lot of times the reaction seems to be that I didn't get a full scholarship to go to college. I didn't get chosen for a specific job because of affirmative action. So how is being white a privilege? I think the example that I gave earlier is a poignant one, that my biggest fear being pulled over is being given a ticket, not losing my life, and being bleeding out in my car or on the pavement somewhere. I think that's probably where we need to stay, because it really is being characterized by your skin and making that snap judgment of, are you a safe person or are you a threat to my life? If we think about the woman in Central Park, and she didn't have her dog on the leash, and that gentleman was kind enough to say to her, hey, you know, the laws here are very clear, you need to have your dog on a leash. And she just started yelling and screaming, and she called 911 and said, there is a black man, or maybe she said African American man, I don't recall which, threatening my life. She knew what she was saying, that would get the most attention to her situation, where she would probably get rescued by the police quicker because he's threatening my life. Nowhere on this planet, if you tell somebody that they need to put a leash on their dog, is that a threat to your own life? So I think there is the leveraging of white privilege that she was using. I don't know if anyone else wants to comment on that, but that's where I'm going to go on that one.
Well, and I would just add to that, Rachel, and thank you for describing that incident. That was just one of several incidents that happened in 2020. And I think she knew, that playing on the fears, playing to those stereotypes, those negative stereotypes would invoke a reaction. And it could have went very badly for I think his name is Christian, had, they responded differently. So thank goodness he was able to record the incident. So you have that video evidence that it was to the contrary. But again, that is a good example of that privilege in which that situation could have resulted in this man either being arrested or losing his life due to playing up some of those negative stereotypes, which results in fear. So it's something that we definitely need to do a better job of having, more, not just conversations about this, but what are we going to do about it as a result of that conversation?
Patricia, unmute yourself.
Yeah, I was trying to unmute. my computer is trying to tell me. I'll let you know when you can talk or not. And I think it's also fitting to speak about 2021, but to go back to 100 years ago to see how white privilege can destroy a life, destroy even a community. This year in 2021, in June 2021, would be the centennial of Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And this genocide, this massacre of an entire community called Black Wall Street. Why? Because the African American community, after abolition of slavery and after being able to move up north and then decided to go west all the way to Oklahoma, created this amazing community of tailors and doctors and just about everything that you need in the community. It was not close to others, but it was built by African Americans. And a young Black man was accused of either robbing or touching a white woman, which after she admitted that it was not him. And the result of that is that, how dare you? So that's white privilege. We're going to therefore do something not just to you, but to the entire community. So it's not just an isolated situation of one person does this or that. Today, as you said, Chris, we have videos, right? We have phones. This young man did not have that to prove his innocence. And therefore he was guilty just for being a brown person. And that was used in this case, just like the woman who, called the police on this man in the Central Park, Rachel, right? So if you look at the results of that, an entire community, how dare you as a Black person touch a white woman? We're going to destroy you and your entire community. So that's white privilege right there.
Thank you for that. And we have an interesting question from Ricardo for all of you, which is, let me just find out. Wait, what is the best way to manage conversation about privilege against pride and joy for working hard for a life of privilege?
Can you read it again, please?
Yes. What is the best way to manage conversations about privilege against pride and joy for working hard for a life of privilege? And if, Ricardo, you want to add something, you can also unmute yourself.
I was wondering if Ricardo could expand and why.
Yes.
Because, knowing him.
It's obviously, I mean, many of us, I would like to assume that we are in a situation where we have the background, the knowledge, the skills to have a conversation with people who we think have a similar level of understanding, empathy, etc. And as we talk about bridging or reaching out to make a better world and connect, some people will say, I want to understand, I want to have the empathy. There's a historical background that shows that there is a privilege, and of course there's cases extreme as the ones we're hearing. At the same time, they may get defensive, and it's not that easy for them to open up when they say, I work so hard, or it wasn't easy for me, and how can I empathize when I also have my own struggles? And that's the thing, is just finding ways or tricks to manage those conversations so we can move forward and not just forward, backwards, and trying to convince or impose a belief. So I'm just wondering, what's your take on that? Because some of them, they say, well, I mean, you work really hard, or your parents work really hard so you can have this type of life. And when they're hearing that, well, it is a privilege and some people don't have that privilege, there's a little bit of defensiveness. So, I mean, I know there's a lot of things around it, but hopefully that kind of helps a little bit clarify the motivation behind my question.
I think, first of all, none of us, whether it's the person with the white privilege or the person who's worked really hard to be where they are, not to be discriminated against. I think the human side, and we've seen it, right, with 2020, with COVID-19, just to be empathetic, just to say, I understand we're going through the same thing, to connect with our emotions, to connect with, I mean, you're in Florida now, Ricardo, when you're going to go through a hurricane, you'll see how people just don't care about race, status. We're all in it together and we help each other. So when you reach out to someone and say, help, I'm hurt, the intent versus impact for me is really important. And when you approach someone with this courageous conversation, I don't think that you meant that, but this is how I feel about it. And it's important for me to tell you, and then find an example of how this person could have reacted to something that's not theirs. But I'm going to quote my dear colleague and co-author of Cultural Detective, African-American, Kelly McLeod Shingen, often says with conviction and emotions, because she's an actress as well, hurt people. And when you hear that, every time I say it and hear it, it gives me goosebumps. So it's truly taking the time to have conversations with people. I know that I find myself very often being hurt by something, and I just want to turn my back and say, the hell with it. I'm just not going to have a conversation or a relationship with this person. I will not go to that store anymore. But we need to pause, because otherwise, if we don't show up, then we're part of the problem. We let it happen. It's normal. That's how they are, and move on. My little 2 cents about that, Ricardo. I don't know if that helps.
If I could just add to that discussion, picking up from there, the discussion or the phrase, everyone can succeed if they just work really hard. That also plays into some of those microaggressions and some of those tropes that African Americans or Blacks are lazy. And so we have to be very careful with that. And that's why history and context is so vitally important. And having that understanding and that background helps us to be able to navigate that space and be able to not only have those conversations, but build that bridge to helping people understand, hey, this is the reason why that is probably not going to be received all that well. And here's the reason or the background as to why. And it requires us to be intentional about understanding that history. And if we're not, we end up doing more to exasperate the situation versus trying to build some empathy and understanding. And I like what you had to say regarding that, Ricardo. That emotional intelligence piece is critical. We need to build that, and specifically the empathy aspect, which the only way that's going to come about is for us to helpfully give people more of the historical context behind that to help them understand why perhaps maybe some of their unconscious or conscious biases may be impacting how they're relating to others.
Okay, and I would like to ask a question to you, Christopher and Patricia, especially what are your experience being a person of color?
I'm just going to bring up an example that's probably timely for 2020 and 2021. My experience is that it's an experience to be a person of color is comes with high privilege in the work of global diversity and so specifically DEI right now. But at the same time, I felt very offended that companies would reach out to me and says, "We want to hire you because you are the face of." And Ricardo, we worked on a project on that last year. It's not a compliment, and it's not a criteria for doing a good job. It could help because of the experiences that I've had. So that's a timely example that I want to give, because in my introduction, I think I gave kind of my position as my experience as a person of color.
I would say it's still a challenge. I am sometimes still not looked at or viewed as a man. Sometimes I'm treated less than as a result of how I show up in the workplace. It's interesting. Sometimes if I wear a coat and tie, I'm treated differently than if I was to have a pair of jeans on and a t-shirt on. So I think it's vitally important that I continue to hold my head up high and continue to walk with a sense of pride and understanding who I am, and also helping others understand as they interact with me that I'm not here to dispel all of the stereotypes that you may have. If you want to get to know me, then get to know me for me. I have to be viewed, should be viewed as a human being, but not as some typical stereotype, negative stereotype that is. So that sometimes can be problematic, and it's still a challenge, I believe. I know for me that I have faced. I'll give you one quick incident. I was in a situation where I was told, "Hey, you must have played basketball or you must have did something athletic because of your build." But it kept being the persistent way in which and how they referred to me instead of acknowledging the other aspects of what I bring to the table. And it was very disheartening because I was working at that time in the Learning and Leadership Development Department. And I continuously got those kind of questions and remarks that came from certain individuals. And then, of course, the one that really is a microaggression that really takes it to that next level. You're a very articulate young man. I'm a very articulate young man because I'm Black. What is it? And so it's important for us to understand these things because these tropes and these stereotypes are very real, and they do show up in a very ugly way in the workplace. We have to do our part to educate, hopefully change some of these attitudes and behaviors so that we can have a more inclusive workplace.
I would like to ask a question to Chris and Patricia. This is a situation that happened to me just recently. I was talking with someone who was recommending a specific series, a drama series that's streaming on some network. And they said, it's really great once you get past the Black cast. And then they followed up with, what was so great about this particular series. And they added, well, they talk Caucasian and they dress Caucasian. I'm so thankful this was a phone call because my jaw was on the floor. I was stunned and I didn't know what to say to this person who is a friend of mine, a close associate, and white. So, Chris, you mentioned microaggressions. I almost feel like these are more like macroaggressions, no? How would you recommend that I respond to something like this, or even how any person, no matter what shade, ethnicity, could respond to something like that?
Well, first and foremost, I think Rachel, thank you for sharing that. I think you have to discern, what's going on at that point in time, the relationship, and then be able to have what we call a crucial conversation with that individual and talk to them and tell them why indeed what they just shared with you is problematic. And give them some context, some history as to why that is problematic and how that could be received and perceived by others. I think it's important for us to do that and to do it in a way where we don't allow, huge gaps of time. Feedback is important, but having timely feedback is critical. And so giving timely feedback is going to be, I think, the catalyst to help me educate that individual on why that unconscious bias or bias that they have is problematic in how they will perhaps maybe interact with other people of color, whether it be, Black, Asian, or Latinx.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, so my what I would add to that is there's an example that I heard actually during our Unconscious Bias series by Dr. Neil Goodman, who's with us today. I always try to step outside of the color because diversity is not just about color. So when something like this comes up, I try to give another example. The first thing that I would think about in this instance that you went through, Rachel, is, well, imagine that back in the correct me if I'm wrong, but let's say 30s, 50s, whenever there was no TV, you would listen to the radio and you would listen to what people were saying and you would not see who's speaking. So that would not have mattered back then, right? So I do activities like that a lot with people across cultures. Listen, do you hear the word? Or if you were to watch a show, are you looking at the person and then feeling, oh, that person was articulate? So the example that I want to give that Dr. Neil Goodman gave us was that the Philharmonic was recruiting musicians and decided to put them behind a curtain because for the longest only men were being picked, not women, because they say, well, a woman cannot carry a big tuba. So when they started listening to the music and then selecting the candidates, we realized that, but not only did it sound great, if it sounded that great, it's because that person could hold a heavy instrument. And it happened to be a woman that was picked. So again, that bias, that visual bias is also just ingrained. And we need to create situations where we get people to see differently, right? To see different. And the last example that I'll give that made me think of is, I grew up in the 60s with teenagers. So, I heard music at 4, 5, 6 years old, the teenagers were enjoying, and I could not understand how the cover of, showing my age, records were showing white people when the music was Black people. And I learned about that when I moved to the US, that's how you sold it. People wanted the music, but did not want it to see that it was Black person behind it. So all of these examples need to show, by giving them, you separate the person from the example and get them to realize, that perception is reality and we need to step aside and think a little more with our heart, huh?
Yeah, I appreciate that. I got thinking about it afterwards about the statement that this person made about they talk Caucasian. And I got thinking, well, what does Caucasian actually sound like? Because in the United States, if you're from Tennessee, you sound one way, but if you're from the Ozarks, you might sound a different way. If you're from Boston, you're going to sound a different way. And these are all potential accents of Caucasians. So that started to confuse me from a linguistic perspective, that I understand what they mean because I understand the code that we speak with one another about being in a good school or in a good neighborhood and things like that. So I appreciate your comments, Chris and Patricia. Thank you so much.
And I have here a question, two questions actually from the audience for you. So one is from Pim and Pim Papart, and she says, Black, African American, a person with color, which one is more polite to refer to someone? Whoever wants to jump in and answer this question.
Chris, you want to take that one first before I add my little salt and pepper?
So I'll give you a situation that happened not too long ago where someone made the comment, colored folks. Now there's a difference between saying someone of color and saying colored folks. Let's come into the 21st century here because that's inappropriate to call someone the colored folk. It's just not going to be socially acceptable, and that harkens back to a day of Jim Crow South. So that's just not going to be acceptable. But calling someone who is maybe Asian, Black, Latin, person of color, in that context, that is by society standards to be acceptable. But referring to someone as either being Black or African American, specifically to that question, is probably the more acceptable way of referring to someone or using that moniker.
Yeah, and so for me being, biracial and multilingual, it's so I understand the root and the people around me and the intercultural people, understanding the roots of those names. I was asked recently, can you say Blacks? Can you say Black Africans? Can you say Black Americans? Well, yes, you have white Africans, you have Black Africans, so you can say both, right? African Americans is definitely going to be more diplomatically or politically correct than saying colored, because again, if we go back a little bit to history, you either were drinking out of the white faucet or the colored faucet. So that showed that discrimination, that division. One thing that I will add, which my friend and colleague and hermano will agree, I love the singer Celia Cruz, and she sings a song called Negrita Tiene Tumbao. And when I sing it, people say, why do you sing this song? It has the word, excuse the language, nigger in it. I said, no, it says negrita. I didn't say the N word, which even if I just said it, right? So it depends on the context. It depends on the region. And because we are so multicultural and we are such a melting pot in the US, we need to really be careful and ask the question, is that okay? Did that offend? And really have those little antennas and see how people react to what was said.
Yeah, how do you want to be referred to? I mean, just asking that simple question, there's nothing wrong with that. How would you like to be referred to? That's important. I have go ahead. I'm sorry.
And that's really tricky for those of us who are white, because we don't want to offend anybody, and we are programmed to say that we're not racist and really take a very hard stance when someone even suggests that we might be exhibiting some kind of racial bias. We really we bristle against that. So it's tricky for us to know, like, what's the right thing to say. My husband, for example, is Black. He is African. He's not yet American. So for African American, for him, it does not apply. He is African and he's also Black. I have a lot of friends and colleagues, especially here in Florida, who are from Jamaica and Haiti and Grenada and so many other Caribbean islands that don't tend to identify as part of the Americas. So a lot of times they just go with Black, but I think their cultures, especially if they were born and raised in the Caribbean, they don't really have the same distrust of colonization. And anybody who's Caribbean, you can definitely correct me on that. I just feel like it's a different position. For here, it's a very sticky situation for white people to know, like, well, what do we call people? The acronym BIPOC, that is something that if you're talking about in general, different people of color, that could be folks from First Nations, it could be Asian, African, for anywhere in the world. I think that's pretty safe. But definitely a Black and white issue is the stickiest here. And there's a lot of hurt, and there's a lot of, I don't even know if there's a right word to call it, but it's divisive. It really is.
And I know it's going to be a totally different session. I do see some, definitely, thank you for the Caribbean folks who come in. And my dear esteemed colleague, Janet Crick from Jamaica. I speak in our Latin America and Caribbean, especially Caribbean program, about, this is all about identity. How do you want to be referred to? So first of all, Mr., Mrs., Sir. It starts with respect, right? And then after that, as you know, we ask Chris, is it Chris or Christopher? So, okay, you can call me Chris. My mother calls me Christopher. Myself, call me Patricia. I don't refer to Pat. If you call Pat, I might not turn around because that's not me. So identity is a big, big, big piece. And if you look at the Caribbean, I got to be careful. That's how to say that. I want to say there's an appreciation. There's a different relationship with colonialism than the US for the Caribbean. Okay, so you'll have Caribbean people saying, I'm West Indian, I'm Bahamian, I'm Jamaican. It really comes with national pride, pride of how they contributed to the independence or just the freedom of the people locally. So it's a different history. That's why it's so important to learn about history and how far people have come. I think it's really about identity and how it resonates with you personally.
Thank you very much. We have a lot of questions actually in the chat. So I know it's a deep, deep conversation. And so we might not have time to tackle all the questions, but you will be able to stay connected with Rachel, Patricia, and Christopher, and you can find them on LinkedIn, and we will make sure we answer to your question. So I don't know if you have time for at least one question now. Yes, okay. So just I saw that I'm taking in order. So the question about, okay, sorry about that. Okay, so from Katie Ellis, what are general responses that you have regarding this statement? Black Lives Matter is political. For example, some people that I know choose not to watch the Super Bowl because Black Lives Matter has politicalized football.
This is very interesting that this question, and thank you, Kathy, for asking this question. I will just tell you, a lot of times because people are uninformed, and let's just call it for what it is. They don't know the history as to why Black Lives Matter actually even came about. Black Lives Matter came about as a result of the injustice of what happened with the shooting of Trayvon Martin back in 2012. That's when that particular group was formed as a result of that, to bring about awareness that this young man, 17 years old, life was taken, and there was no justice and no accountability for the person who shot him, Zimmerman. And so that's how it came about. Fast forward, here we are in 2020, and we had Ahmaud Arbery, we had George Floyd, we had Breonna Taylor. We had so many incidents that happened in 2020 but yet they've been happening in between 2012 and 2020. But because of COVID and everybody was pretty much working from home and life has virtually stopped to some point, people were able to pay more attention because we didn't have all the other distractions. Colin Kaepernick took a knee to basically protest the fact that, hey, these injustices are happening, and yet there's been no accountability. The NFL finally acknowledged that, hey, oh, by the way, you know what? I think you're right, because wow, we've seen incident after incident after incident happen. And specifically what happened with George Floyd, we suddenly realized, systematic racism actually exists. Well, no duh. It's been around for hundreds of years now. Wake up, we've been trying to tell you. And so I think having a conversation with those individuals to implore them and challenge them to understand the history behind why Black Lives Matter actually came about will help them to perhaps maybe develop some sense of empathy. But then again, it's going to depend. Some individuals are open to that kind of information, and others will stick to their particular narrative because it makes them feel either good or it fits their particular paradigm. That's my 2 cents on it. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to suggest if you can have a conversation, which I've had with a neighbor who's an African-American man who is a police officer. He's actually a Florida Highway Patrol. If you were to have a conversation of what does it mean, what does Black Lives Matter mean to you as a cop, right, as a police officer, it's incredible because he'll explain it like exactly as Chris just did, not talking about police brutality or anything, just really focusing on the injustice of a specific group of people. So that's pretty powerful to have those conversations with the armed forces in this case.
I just wanted to add that Emmanuel Acho, who did play for the NFL, has a wonderful YouTube channel that's called Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man. And he had a part 1 and a part 2 where he sat down with Roger Goodell about Colin Kaepernick starting this movement with the NFL. And the lessons that Roger Goodell has learned as a result of it is a really poignant conversation that they have. So poignant, they actually had 2 episodes. And Emmanuel Acho also sat down with a group of police officers from a specific community that is primarily white, and their police force is white. And just hearing some of those conversations was very fruitful for me to hear what it is that they're talking about. One of the questions that he asked one of the police officers was, when is the last time you invited a Black person, Black couple, Black family into your home? And the officer immediately said, well, definitely before COVID. And then he paused and said, I don't think I've ever had any Black folks over to my home. And good on them for actually talking frankly about what is happening. He also has the book, Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man, which I highly recommend for those who are trying to get informed on some of these issues.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And since we are coming to the end, we have a couple of more minutes. And I know Chris has an engagement after. So I would like just a final comment from Chris, Patricia, and Rachel, maybe starting with Chris again. What would be your advice for our listeners today to become more aware or become an ally?
Thank you for that. And I really appreciate everyone being on this call today and giving us an opportunity to share. I would say the biggest thing is just being able to just be intentional about learning other cultures. Don't talk about it, but be about it. Really, truly bridge that gap, get involved, and not sit on the sideline. If we really, truly want to make a difference, then we got to get into the game. And you got to have some skin in the game. And that was something that was always told to me. If you want to be a change maker, if you want to be a part of the change, then get involved. Don't sit on the sideline. Don't just give lip service to this. Let's really make some real contact with people and get involved in our communities and have these uncomfortable conversations with people to help raise their awareness. Because a lot of times people are getting their information from one particular source and one source only. And as a result of that, that has framed their paradigm, and they're staunch and stuck in that paradigm. And they need real information, balanced information to help them make that shift and move them, hopefully, their attitudes, which would hopefully impact their behaviors and their relationships with others. So the biggest thing for me is get out there and just be intentional about learning to understand others. Again, thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris, for being here. We appreciate you and your experience. Thank you.
So for me, I would just say, watch to truly see people of color, engage, and don't turn your back on situations. It's speak up, and make a difference. Don't turn your back on situations. You know, the inclusion is including all.
My advice would be to get uncomfortable, start attending events, most of which will be online right now,
Right.
that are part of a specific group, whether it's religion or beliefs, values, anything like that, where you can just go and experience. Because I think as in the United States, we're so focused on Black history starts with slavery and moves forward from there. And we're not really educated on the fact that there's a fork in the road for Africans. The one part of the road veers off into being enslaved. And I use the word enslaved very intentionally, because not all Black people are slaves or were slaves. So they were put into a situation. And the other part of the road that veered off for Africans are where my husband and his family are. They're a royal family from a tribe in Western Africa, and they were untouched by slavery. So I think we need to stop thinking in terms of emancipation and looking at heroes like Lincoln and LBJ. If you actually read the Emancipation Proclamation, you'll see that it wasn't 100% emancipating to all, like we have been taught in school. So challenging some of those things that we've been told and taught, and being an ally can only happen if you're fully up on what are the situations. I think if you have that one Black friend and you're asking them all the questions, don't fatigue that person, especially if they don't have a background in diversity, equity, and inclusion. They may not have all the answers. They may have all the feelings. They may have all the experiences, but they may not actually have some of the training that goes along with inclusion and equity. So that's what I would say is get informed, challenge your own thinking, surround yourself with like-minded people of all walks of life, and just put yourself in a posture of learning.
Thank you very much, Rachel, Patricia, and Chris, for your great advice for listeners. And we didn't have time to answer to questions from Shanoy and Yumi. So if you want, we can answer to your question. You can send us by email your question at sietaflorida@gmail.com. And yes, and we will be happy to answer to your question, and stay connected with us. We are on Facebook and LinkedIn and Instagram. So yes, thank you very much, everyone, for being here with us today. And see you at the next Sieta Florida or Sieta USA event. Enjoy your day. Bye, everyone. Thank you.